Welcome back, or welcome to the Rebel Tech Podcast, where we discuss the promises and perils of emerging technology and the social, political, and policy landscape in Texas. Alongside my co-host, David Dunmoyer, I'm Zach Whiting, Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today, we're going to discuss blockchain, cryptocurrency, and more with Lee Bratcher and Brian Morgenstern. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
So before we dive into the actual topic, let's just have you guys introduce yourselves to the audience. What's your background and what is your work in this space?
I'm Brian Morgenstern. So I'm the head of public policy for Riot Platforms, one of the biggest publicly traded Bitcoin mining enterprises in the world. Our biggest operations are right here in Texas. We have a facility in Corsicana, about an hour from Dallas, and in Rockdale, about an hour from where we sit here in Austin. Prior to joining Riot, I worked in the Trump administration. I was deputy press secretary and deputy communications director at the White House, and before that, I was deputy assistant secretary of the Treasury Department. I got to work on a lot of really cool things, including regulatory reports on how the U.S. can lead in innovation if we have regulatory sandboxes, if we don't hold back innovators with excess regulation, but actually try to lead the world in these issues. So that's where I first became fascinated with it. Now that I get to do it on a day-to-day basis, it's just been more and more fun as I learn more and more every day. So thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
And we noted too that you are the most traveled guest that we've had of anyone on the podcast. So did you flew out today from Washington, D.C.? Is that right?
I did. I'm in Austin frequently.
Yeah.
And I did live north of Dallas for a time. But yes, I cover both federal and state. So I came in from D.C. today. So always good to visit the Texas Capitol.
Yeah. Well, glad to have you. And Lee, welcome.
Yeah. David, Zach, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So Lee Bratcher, the president of the Texas Blockchain Council. We are a trade association working to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin, blockchain, digital assets. We have a specialty in Bitcoin mining and energy policy advocacy. We've done a lot of work with ERCOT over the years. Before this role, before I founded the council in 2019, I was a political science professor at Dallas Baptist University. Before that, or I guess during that time, for the last 14 years, I've been an Army officer in the Army Reserves, tech scout at 75th Innovation Command, supporting Army Futures Command, which is right here in Austin. And then just one piece on the academic side. So a political science professor, my research area was property rights, which I think is something that TPPF knows something about. I was at the War College, the Army War College, researching property rights and how it can lead to less conflict with developing nations overseas. And I discovered the Bitcoin white paper and discovered digital property rights.
Yes.
And so my research then morphed into blockchain for land administration. How can we increase transparency, for the oldest and the most valuable asset known to man, which is real estate. And that's led me to where I am today.
I did not know that you were a professor of political science at Dallas Baptist University. This is totally off script here. We recently had a conversation about ranking presidents historically. If they were in office today, who would be the most bullish on tech? Did you stumble upon any philosophers that you thought had some interesting insights on blockchain, on digital property rights? And if there's, for listeners out there, did Jefferson have something that's applicable there? Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I would actually think first to the Austrian School of Economics, the Hayeks of the world, the Mises of the world. Yes. I think it's pretty clear, Milton Friedman, it's pretty clear that the white paper and sort of this ethos and philosophy has underpinnings in Austrian economics. And so then if you were to apply that to, obviously the Austrian school didn't exist as an economic discipline when Jefferson was around, but, certainly by the time that we have Reagan, it's in full swing and, battling it out with the Keynesianists.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And here we are today still doing the same thing.
That's right.
Well, I know I'm not going to steal your thunder on the next question here.
No.
But we at TBPF, I know we've worked with you, Lee, for quite some time, and Brian, we've had the pleasure of recently getting connected with you and learning from some of the great work you guys have really been championing. When we started the technology initiative here at TBPF, then Kevin Roberts, I know one of the missions was, hey, can you check out this whole blockchain and cryptocurrency thing? If I'm not mistaken, one of your first roles was to work with the Texas Blockchain Working Group. Is that right?
Yeah, so Texas did. They had a work group on blockchain matters, and that was a great work group, and had some great involvement from some of your membership, and that was a really interesting thing. And yeah, that was the big hot thing when I started here about 3 years ago. Is what's this crypto thing? And so that was a lot of fun. It was great to be able to participate because there were so many people with great perspectives on that work group, and trying to help make it accessible to the public, but also importantly trying to establish, and we talked about kind of the regulatory framework, and it's finding that light touch framework, and in this case looking at the UCC and how do you capture appropriately digital assets in it without squandering the industry. So that was a great thing to be a part of, and what my part of it was I testified once or twice before it, but that was great work that work group did. So we do want to dive in and try to talk as applied to certain things, Bitcoin's $100,000 and their Operation Choke Point and all these things that people might be aware of, but just kind of as a level set. Maybe we'll go to you first on what blockchain is, and then maybe Brian, we can just have you pop in on what is cryptocurrency, just to give our viewers that maybe aren't so familiar with this, just a quick rundown on sort of what those two are, and are they the same thing? Are they different? So we'll go to you first on what is blockchain.
Yeah. At its core, it's a decentralized digital ledger. And if you think back, for the last 500 years, we've had a pretty incredible accounting system called double entry accounting. It was developed by Luca Pacioli during the Renaissance, and it allowed people to trade and transfer value over time and space without having to trust their counterparty necessarily, right? Blockchain is the next iteration of double entry accounting. It's the ability to transfer value. Not only do you not have to trust your counterparty, you don't actually have to trust an intermediary either, which is the first time that we've ever had that, except for face-to-face cash transactions or bartering, which is very inefficient in the modern economy. So that's generally how I explain what the technology is a value transfer system. Of course, Bitcoin was the genesis of all that, but that kind of goes into, I don't want to steal Brian's thunder to talk about that side of things.
Sure. So that's a good explanation. Bitcoin, it's been described to me in a number of different ways: digital gold, a hedge against inflation, a way of storing, transferring value electronically, peer-to-peer, all around the world. The network can kind of be simplified to like a clock, that it is a way of, with code, determining that this person in this time in this place owns this thing. And it's immutable, it can't be changed. It is a ledger, as Lee says, and that value is memorialized on this network without a bank, without a government. And in the case of Bitcoin, because there's a supply cap that's baked into this cake, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. The rules and you can't print more money. You can't deficit spend on Bitcoin. It is, in that sense, it's more akin to digital gold, that it's a finite resource. And it is tracked by a wallet address at a specific date at a specific time, so that you can't, it's very hard to commit fraud, because the same Bitcoin can't exist in two places at once. And so, Bitcoin started in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, when people started to lose trust in those intermediaries, as Lee alluded to, like banks and governments, because governments were debasing currency, bailing out banks. Became sort of a populist almost uprising, that people wanted to take control of their own finances. So Bitcoin's frequently referred to, another moniker for it is freedom money, that it's something that you can control. You are your own bank, in essence. And so that's really the value. And it's the antithesis of something that has entered the public discourse these days, a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. And that is very problematic because a government like the Chinese Communist government would use that to control their population. They can say, if they're the ones issuing the digital currency, then they can say you can only spend it in this time and in this place and on these things. You can't buy a gun with this because we, the Communist Party of China, control it. Or you can't buy more gasoline today, or you can't buy beef today, or whatever it may be. So it's very important because it's empowering to the individual over the state. And so that is really the important value proposition. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the energy issues, which are really important and interesting and will help Texas thrive, I think, in the years to come. But a lot of times when people attack Bitcoin, it'll be, well, what's really the value of it? Freedom is really the value of it. And so if you're going to tell me that that's a bad use of electricity, holy moly, we're going to have a pretty robust argument. But so let me stop there. But that's in essence what it is. It's different from other cryptocurrencies because other ones may have strong influence from the founders of that coin, and they may be able to change the rules depending on how much market share they have. Maybe they can print more coins. They may be able to debase it, or maybe they're taking too big a stake. There's no Mr. Bitcoin. Satoshi invented it. He's pseudonymous. Many people think he's passed away by now, but he's not controlling the network. No one is controlling the network. It's controlled by the people who use it. And no individual can change those rules. No individual can print more Bitcoin. So that's why I get so excited about it and why I think it's so important and why it's hit $100,000 per coin and why I think it's going to go way up from there. And if it does reach gold parity, I mean, that alone would be another 8x at least from where it is now.
And for the record, for the sake of our show's virality, now would be a great time to announce if either of you are Satoshi. If you want to unmask yourselves, we'll take the clout that comes with it. So there's a lot of great things you'll unpack there. And I think the explanation of the underlying technology is so crucial in terms of it's not just Bitcoin, although Bitcoin is at the core of this movement. Back to you for a second, Brian. You mentioned, if energy is the cost for freedom, it's a pretty good use of that capital. Can you talk for a second about what we've seen with some of the debanking issues and why decentralization is such a good antidote to that, whether it's Operation Choke Point, Zach mentioned, Trucker Convoy, however you want to take it, but what are we up against here?
And Trump administration officials or affiliates that were debanked, those are, you use the Chinese examples. These things have happened, in the United States and in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously very timely because when Mark Andreessen was on the Joe Rogan podcast, he talked about debanking about how tech entrepreneurs were being debanked. And so that was probably the first time a lot of people heard about this. This is kind of old hat for Lee and myself. We've been dealing with this issue and fighting the government about it for a long time. The first iteration of Operation Choke Point was during the Obama administration when they determined that there were certain politically disfavored businesses that they didn't like, and they decided they were too risky, and so they engaged in something that was really extra legal. It wasn't through rulemakings or legislation. It was through sort of winks and nods and press releases and sending signals that gun manufacturers, payday lenders, some other businesses that they determined shouldn't be operating, they said, well, let's cut them off from the banking system. So that was happening. There was a lawsuit about it. There was a subsequent investigation that revealed that this was actually happening, that it was constitutionally improper because it was denying people due process. So it went away when Trump became president, and we had new bank regulators. They put in a fair access rule, so that if you're a legal business or a a person who's not doing anything illegal. You should have access to financial services. Fast forward, the Biden administration came in, and literally the same chairman of the FDIC came back and just started doing the same thing, but he expanded his scope to tech businesses he didn't like, including Bitcoin and digital asset related businesses. And so we saw people and companies across our space get debanked. That's our perspective. There are also politically, controversial figures who had their bank accounts closed. The Canadian truckers probably hits home for a lot of, particularly Texans who are more freedom-minded. You don't have to be anti-vaccine to think that the mandates were a little overbearing. It was overreach. And so in Canada, you had these trucker convoys protesting against the mandates. And Canada started debanking those people, deplatforming them from GoFundMe, going after the donors to those convoys who were peacefully protesting, just making their voices heard. That's an example that I think a lot of people have heard about, but it was happening behind closed doors for all sorts of people, including businesses in our space, from big to small and everything in between. And it was totally illegal, and it was oppressive, and it was overreach, and it was outrageous. And so I'm grateful that it's now really out there in the public, but that really underscores the value of Bitcoin and digital assets, that you can have your freedom and not have to succumb to such outrageous government overreach. So we're very glad that this is now in the public discourse. Congressman French Hill announced that he intends to investigate this issue and make sure it never happens again. Hopefully we'll have another fair access rule. Hopefully we'll get legislation to prevent political discrimination in our economic system. Should never happen. That's what China was doing. Yeah. When China was banning Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, some of the methods they used were calling up their financial regulators and saying, go after these businesses, cut them off from financial services. They were spinning up the environmental regulators, saying if they use electricity, let's loop them under that bailiwick and let's go after them for that. Let's make sure they can't operate their businesses. And then you had the U.S. government almost taking pages from that playbook. Yeah. So it was very scary. We're very glad that it's exposed now, and hopefully we're in a place now where we can make sure it never happens again.
Amen. Yeah.
One of kind of piggybacking off of that, you mentioned the sort of the energy and the electricity side of things, environmental concerns, any energy concerns. That is something that people talk about. Can you talk about some of those issues? How does blockchain, how does the crypto space fit in with this sort of energy environment that we have in Texas, Lee?
Yeah. So if you think about the way that this process works, it's using computers. These computers consume energy, and initially it didn't consume all that much energy, but as the network has grown and become a global phenomenon, it is now consuming a good amount of energy, and by some estimates, up to 3 to 4% of all power consumed in Texas is consumed in Bitcoin mining, which at first glance might sound like a alarmingly large number. But if you look at where and what time and how the energy is consumed, our grid is not, some zero-sum game. There is abundant energy in the state of Texas. Our challenge is getting it to where we need to have it at the time of day, in the geography that we want it. Because we have so much energy in West Texas and hardly any consumption, there's negatively priced energy sometimes. There's energy that goes to waste all the time. And so a Bitcoin miner is incentivized to seek out those pockets of stranded energy, whether it's on-grid stranded energy or off-grid stranded energy, and consume that energy all the while for the benefit of the taxpayer, for the benefit of the community, because it's creating jobs. And then obviously, the tax base is increased by that action as well. And anybody who's kind of in the free market mindset would think, better to do that than to have that energy go to waste. Mm-hmm. If the federal government is going to continue to subsidize, renewables, which I think we all think is a little bit short-sighted, because renewables aren't bad in and of themselves, but an abundance of renewables does create some challenges for managing a grid. we need to have flexible loads like Bitcoin mining to be able to take the sting or the edge off of that intermittent generation. And there is no large scale load flexible in any grid in the world like Bitcoin mining. We've been at the tip of the spear of this for many years, and it's been crazy to walk side by side with grid operators, with policymakers, because no one's had to, walk through this before. No one's had to, create policy around a large flexible load. The other, hydrogen behind us is kind of potentially a large flexible load, but they don't even know how flexible they will be. Bitcoin miners are flexible in some cases to the second, which is unheard of in the realm of grid policy.
So I want to pick up where Lee left off on that a little bit, because Texas, if the Texas miracle is going to continue and we're going to have all these new industries coming, and the biggest migration, interstate migration in recent years has been from California to Texas because of how favorable the business environment is here. It's fantastic to do business here. If we're going to keep up with the demand, we need more power. So you need demand signals. You need customers for that power. So Lee talked about the energy demand. The concern is at peak demand, which is like 1% of the year when it's really hot or really cold. Well, Bitcoin miners are one of the few loads that can actually turn down their operations. We can actually work with ERCOT and be like a dimmer switch. So if you have peaker plants coming on, we can absorb some excess load, or if we're coming up to peak demand, we can turn down and make more load available. Now, if you are a power generator, are you going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to create a new plant if maybe you're only really needed like 1% of the time? You need a customer to sell that power to during other times. And you need a customer who's going to be able to make that power available to the grid when at that peak demand moment. So if the Texas Energy Fund, which the legislature in its wisdom has created to help financing for new energy projects, if that's going to work, you need customers during those off-peak times, and that's your Bitcoin mining, a flexible load like that. So
the overnight hours, the shoulder months, that's why no one's building natural gas generation in Texas, is because they're going to get creamed. They're counting on those 1% of times to make their money.
Right.
And, all the other times, wind and solar can just say, hey, we'll operate when we're not profitable because we have the subsidy. And that crushes the margins for other types of firm generation.
See, I think of this. I mean, I'm assuming all of us were here for Winter Storm Uri in February of 2021, and you were getting all these notices. Hey, if you're in an area where you are getting energy, you're on a critical grid, reduce your consumption, turn down the heater. And sure, folks did. Texans stepped up incrementally. There was a fractional amount that each household could do. But you guys are talking about bringing investments here that create the market signal to invest in more energy. So investment begets more investment. And then here is a solution in the instance of a Uri type situation where the grid doesn't have the same capacity to bring down that consumption such that we can ramp it up in other areas. I think that's a point that doesn't get hit enough, because it is, and on the show here, we're not always the full like free market magic in every single way, shape, and form. There's some issues with social media and all that. This is the most free market answer you can have to energy consumption. And I don't know if either of you want to comment. Senate Business and Commerce, there was a really critical hearing that happened during the interim where I think that was the first time folks really contended with, okay, how are we going to take data centers and crypto into this portfolio of, we're already seeing population growth, so residential energy consumption's going up, more businesses are coming here. I guess the question, and this is to anyone here, how does Texas balance that delivery of energy for the growing population of residential with that of the industries like crypto and data centers? Do we have to look to nuclear? Is this something the federal level will look to a Doge Commission and other ways to cut waste? I don't know if there's any thoughts there, because a lot of lawmakers, I think, would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, my first response is that if you don't want rolling blackouts or brownouts, you need flexible loads. And the most flexible load is Bitcoin mining. it creates economic development in rural areas as opposed to a lot of data center businesses. And there's a lot of great American companies with more traditional data centers, not knocking them, but they are typically more in heavily populated urban areas. They oftentimes have to be on 24/7. If, I don't know, an AWS data center goes down, like somebody's website is not going to function for a while. Like, you don't really want that, right? So if you want flexibility and you want to avoid blackouts, you need more flexible loads. Bitcoin mining is the most flexible load. Now, there's other ways data centers can be helpful as well. If they have backup generation, then they can potentially use their backup generation, make their grid power available to the market. There's other ways of working those things out. But some of the things that came up in that hearing, there's hedging. So a lot of businesses will do long-term power contracts. They pay a fixed price that's usually above your typical spot market price. You can then, during scarcity moments, sometimes you can earn energy credits by making your power available, which decreases your average cost of power over time. That's gotten some splashy headlines that don't actually explain the whole situation. If your power bill is in the hundreds of millions of dollars and you're just trying to level out that average, that's helpful to the market. It puts downward pressure on prices. It's good for your business. It's good for Texas. So my short answer is inviting more flexible loads into the market is going to be very good for Texas in the long term. In terms of the federal level, I mean, thank God Texas still has ERCOT.
Yeah.
And I think it would, my personal opinion is that, there was a bill proposed by a member of Congress
Greg Casar.
To basically put Texas under the federal jurisdiction.
Texas can't be Texas. Let's see how that goes over with our Texas congregation that actually cares about freedom.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want more generation, you don't want to add more layers of bureaucracy and regulation. That's going to slow it down. So I think Texas remaining Texas and having more flexible loads is going to help solve that problem. And it's going to invite more generation into ERCOT because you're going to have that positive price signal. You're going to have a customer that can be an investor in an energy project and a customer of the energy project at the same time. And so that's I think how you help foster that long-term growth in nuclear, in natural gas. I'm an all of the above person. I think long-term nuclear, we need nuclear, but natural gas is here. It's liquid gold, as President Trump likes to refer to it. I think he's right about that. And he actually had made a statement that he thinks that Bitcoin mining, he wants the U.S. to be the Bitcoin superpower of the world, but he also noted that it will help us be energy dominant. And I think he is exactly right when he said that.
Was that you as deputy press secretary who was making that statement for him? No.
I may have planted a seed, but he got it. Yeah, and he's right on the money on this issue.
Yeah.
Lee, in the past when we've talked and we've kind of when we first got to know each other, we're getting ready to go into a session, and I know there were some bills and some ideas floating around. One of them was kind of updating the code for digital assets. There was flare gas and tax and all that sort of stuff. Going into this 2025 session, is there anything on your guys' radar that you are looking at that you would like to see done, or is there anything that people are talking about that you have any pause or concern about?
A lot of thoughts here. I'll start off with some low-hanging fruit. There's several members of the legislature that we're working with on regulating crypto ATMs. Crypto ATMs are part of the industry, just like cash. Bitcoin and crypto can be used for nefarious purposes, and a lot of people may have that in their mind. When you actually look at the on-chain analytics and the data from the law enforcement agencies, less than 1% of Bitcoin transactions are black market type transactions, but they still exist. And crypto ATMs are part of where that exists. And there's, for some reason, the federal government does not require KYC AML under a certain threshold. So we are working on some legislation that would, make a little bit more, regulate the crypto ATM space a little bit more tightly. I think people would certainly, both in the industry and outside the industry could see why we would want to do that. Because of the transparency of Bitcoin and other digital assets, criminals are actually moving back to just using old-fashioned cash. But we still want to keep that number going down from less than 1% to less than 0.1%. We want to make sure that that we can do everything we can. So that's one area. We're also working on an unclaimed property bill where right now the state of Texas sells all of the digital assets that they get in for unclaimed property. And a lot of the big corporations in the country and us think that that may not be the best place for that. Why don't we keep it in its native asset form? So if someone comes back and claims that in 5 years and it's 10x in value, they can experience that appreciation. So on the Bitcoin mining side, I think there's some things, there's some conversations going around where last session there was Senate Bill 1751, and that would have removed Bitcoin miners from ancillary services, which is demand response, ERCOT's demand response programs. And we vehemently oppose that bill because it actually takes away a tool from the ERCOT's tool belt to use Bitcoin miners like a dimmer switch, which is what Brian mentioned. Most Bitcoin miners are not in ancillary services. They're just turning off because they're allergic to high prices, I like to say. So when demand gets high and prices go high, they want to turn off. But the ones that are in ancillary services like demand response, we don't want to take that tool out of ERCOT's hands, right? That's when the dimmer switch comes into play, and ERCOT uses it. Maybe they keep Bitcoin miners on past the point at which they would otherwise turn off so that they could have it in reserve to cut it off. So there's a couple things that we're thinking through on that front. Of course, there is a bill that we're also working on, a Texas Strategic Bitcoin Reserve bill that would not be taxpayer funded. I'll lead with that. Individuals and companies would donate Bitcoin to a fund controlled by the Texas Comptroller, where that fund could be remain in Bitcoin, and the comptroller or the governor or whoever could determine that in 5 years the interest from that is going to support some cause, beautification of the Capitol grounds, or fallen DPS, the families of fallen DPS troopers. There's just some cause that the whole state can rally behind, and we can all know that no taxpayer funds were used to establish the fund. It was just Texas individuals and companies that have an interest in seeing the Texas miracle continue, and that's just some small way of doing that. Of course, the Texas miracle is going to continue because Texas continues to be a light touch regulatory state, and I don't think this legislature or any future legislature is going to change that. But it's just our way of giving back in a sense. And so those are a couple of things that we have. There's others, but I'll pause there in case you have any thoughts on all those.
Well, I do have one follow-up question, is I know you obviously work in numerous states, you do as well. In Texas, who are some of the folks that are kind of the key leaders on crypto and blockchain policy that have either self-identified or you've identified as champions, just for our listeners to know?
Yeah, I mean, Chairman Capriglione is a chairman of financial services, pensions, investments, and financial services in the House, and he's a great advocate for innovation for Texas. We've enjoyed working with him for a long time, and I know you guys work with him as well on technology. There's nobody smarter in the in the legislature, and I think the other legislatures would tip their hat to Chairman Capriglione on that front. Chairman Harris, Cody Harris, is a great champion for freedom and innovation. He's been to several of the Bitcoin mining sites throughout Texas. He understands the value of Bitcoin. He's passed some pro-Bitcoin and anti-CBDC, resolutions in the past. On the Senate side, you've got Senator Tan Parker, who continually shows up as an innovator. And I'll just tell a quick story on Senator Parker and Senator Paxton. The day that Winter Storm Uri started, I was actually in Rockdale at the Riot facility. This was even before Riot purchased that acquired that facility. And ICE was starting to form. We didn't know we were doing a legislative tour, and there was about 7 members. Senator Parker was coming down from Fort Worth. The roads iced over. He couldn't make it. Senator Paxton and several other members of the legislature made it. And we heard the Bitcoin mine started to shut down. And we were like, oh, I wonder what's going on. Well, power prices were spiking.
Yeah.
This was I think it was Thursday or Friday. It was the very front end of the storm.
Right.
And Senator Paxton turned to me and said, well, I'm glad they're turning off. We had no idea that the Riot facility there in Rockdale will be off for the next 5 days. And that's an interesting point. Batteries are amazing for the grid, but they are only on for 4 hours or 2 hours before they need to recharge. A Bitcoin mine, which is obviously on the demand side, whereas batteries on the supply side. But those megawatts, the grid doesn't care if it gets that from supply, 1 extra megawatt in supply or 1 fewer megawatt on demand. Bitcoin miners can be off for days. So think about that in any sort of scenario where, like, hey, we need to lose 10% of our demand for 2 days.
Yeah.
Well, 4% of it can be Bitcoin mining.
Right.
No problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there, and circumstances have changed a lot. Thank goodness. For starters, the peak price has been almost cut in half for power, which I think has been welcome, especially with the litigation and everything that followed. But I'd pick up on a couple of thoughts. One, the ancillary services piece. So for the miners that are involved in that, you're going to have costs. Either ERCOT's keeping you on, which is actually a frequent occurrence, in which case you're paying higher power prices than you otherwise would, or they're turning you off, in which case you're not making your Bitcoin mining revenue. But even that being the case, the bids into those programs for Bitcoin miners are typically much, much cheaper than other types of businesses. So they actually drive down the cost of ancillary services for ratepayers. So it's not just good for Texas and good for the businesses. It's good for homeowners and just your everyday Texan. A couple of other legislative ideas that we've just kind of been knocking around, because if we don't have a reliable grid, we don't have a business. So we really want a reliable grid. And some of the estimates that we've seen coming out about power demand, we think are alarming, but also not accurate. And so the very good news is there have been some independent studies showing that this 150 gigawatt demand estimate by 2030, that's what ERCOT had put out. That's not really realistic, but in fairness to ERCOT, they also don't really have the tools to get accurate estimates, because the way it works is any business that's considering a new site for operations, they might be looking at 5 different sites, but they're actually only going to build 1. But all 5 are built into this model. So if we can get more accurate projections, it's going to take the temperature down, going to take the anxiety down, and we'll figure out more accurately what do we need to build for generation. And you'll get a better matchup of generators to off-takers, and just that accuracy in projections is going to make grid planning a lot easier for everybody. And then likewise, because we're such flexible loads, being able to model the flexibility, because the concern is peak demand. But if you have all these gigawatts that are able to come off at peak demand, then that's going to change your projections and make them more accurate as well. So that it's going to lead to a much more resilient, strong energy grid and just much easier grid planning. So those are some ideas that we're trying to socialize that will be helpful, not just to our industry, but to the Texas grid. Because like I said, we need a reliable grid.
Yeah. Well, the last question I have, which kind of builds on legislative priorities for both y'all's organizations, zooming out, because I'd be remiss not to highlight the awesome announcement, David Sachs to be czar of AI and cryptocurrency. And for folks listening, Sachs has an incredible background as one of the PayPal Mafia members, COO. He's an entrepreneur. He's a forward thinker. But I have 2 experts in the room who deal with this policy, and I imagine you'll be involved in the next administration in some way, shape, or form. What do you think is reasonable to expect in the next 4 years of Trump 47? What are thoughts on David Sachs, and really anything you want to highlight at the federal level?
Well, a few priorities. I mean, he's been a leader on this debanking issue, so putting a stop to that will be very important. That's known as Operation Choke Point 2.0. Something that I think of as Choke Point 3.0 relates to energy, and that's because the Biden administration tried to essentially create a registry of Bitcoin miners, and they had issued a statement from the White House expressing a desire to limit or eliminate Bitcoin mining in the United States. Can you imagine the U.S. government saying, we don't want your business here? But that's basically what they did. And so they did an emergency request for information under threat of criminal penalties, demanding that we hand over confidential business information, including our power contracts and power bills. And we think that was one step on the way to then having some of their activist friends come and protest, create political risk, so that then all of a sudden power contracts become too complicated for us to actually get. So first they came after our bank accounts, then they came after our electricity. It was ridiculous. It was totally unlawful. So we sued and won, thank goodness. But I think flipping this outlook on its head to how can these businesses help create more energy in America, because the president has expressed the desire for us to lead on digital assets, to lead on Bitcoin, and to lead in energy and power. So I think that's going to be a really, really critical part of it. And then, of course, David is very well versed on AI issues. He's talked, and Mark Andreessen talked about how the Biden administration approach was a top-down control approach. I think he will want to foster a more robust startup environment and let the market develop in a more natural way, compared to having the government really just grab control of it and try to steer it. So those are a few of the things that I'm looking at. I think he's a brilliant guy, and I'm very excited by this pick. And the fact that the administration is going from trying to put us out of business to finding ways to help us thrive. You don't get a clearer contrast than that. And it is, I think it's one of the reasons you're seeing the Bitcoin price go up, because we're going to have a much more reasonable regulatory environment. And I think David Sachs is going to be very instrumental in ushering that in.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting too, I think a lot of folks I talked to in the Capitol, when I asked them, who is the AI czar who is technically still under the Biden administration, nobody knows. It's Kamala Harris. It was one of those where it's kind of hastily slap on another title and a role, and just like the border, nothing happened. If anything, there was onerous, I think the longest executive order in the history of our country that didn't do anything except for create regulations and confusion. But the point is, this is a clear signal. There's a standalone position for AI and crypto, and we should be rejoicing that it's somebody who's in that build back better. I can't believe I just used that terminology.
I was going to say, wait a second.
Building like we used to as a country, instead of letting, the specific industry or lobby interests capture the process. And really 4 years of, thank God we had entrepreneurs who were fighting the front lines. There's still growth in the crypto industry in spite of what the Biden administration did. So, I ask a question to you too, from the national perspective. Y'all are Texas focused, but any work you're going to do in concert with the feds?
Well, I think I'll go back to what Brian was talking about with the lawsuit. That was clearly driven by Senator Elizabeth Warren, the lawsuit they were trying to pursue and pull data from the Bitcoin miners. And it was designed so that she could shame, in her strange kind of moral compass type of way, certain power companies. And why did she want to do that? Elizabeth Warren wants a central bank digital currency.
Yes.
And I think maybe she wants it for some good reasons, but mostly she wants it for control, right? And so Bitcoin mining is the antithesis of a central bank digital currency, or Bitcoin is. And so, there's freedom money over here, and then there's money over here where the central government, the federal government, could impose a negative interest rate on your savings account because it's, a fully controlled digital currency. It's sort of like the bastardization of blockchain, if you will. They could, like they do in China, prohibit you from buying things that are politically out of favor. Now, mind you, not illegal things, but just things that are politically out of favor. And that's dystopian. So we think that, obviously in DC, we're fully expecting just all we actually want is just fair treatment. We don't want like beneficial treatment or anything like that. We just want to be treated like other industries. And I think across the country, this kind of juxtaposition of central bank digital currencies and Bitcoin mining, it's really an incongruent or incoherent position to be for freedom against central bank digital currencies, but not understanding the value of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to make sure that those things are on the table so that people can see, all right, most Texans don't want central bank digital currencies, but they might not yet see that connection. Well,
sure.
The antithesis, the flip side of the coin to that is keeping cash, the U.S. dollar, and not allowing the federal government to outlaw cash for digital payments altogether, and Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Those two things right there. And Bitcoin, I think a lot of your listeners may be kind of curious about the dollar's position as the U.S. As the global reserve currency. Mm-hmm. And some people think, and some people have unwisely said, well, Bitcoin is competing with the dollar. And that's absolutely not the case. Bitcoin can supplement and prolong the dollar as a world reserve currency. If we are energy dominant, if we are dominant in reserve assets like oil, gold, and Bitcoin, then the amount of demand for our dollar will skyrocket. Mm-hmm. The demand for treasuries will skyrocket. A little, nugget of that is what Brian and Senator Toomey talked about on stage at our conference a couple weeks ago, which is stablecoins. Mm-hmm. Stablecoins already buy like $200 billion worth of U.S. treasuries. Every stablecoin has to be backed by a U.S. dollar. It's stable to the value of the dollar, and every dollar that goes into a treasury. If stablecoins were a country, they'd buy more U.S. treasuries than the country of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. So as stablecoins grow, it increases demand for dollars. So you have that Bitcoin, stablecoin, energy dominance, all of those narratives prolong the dollar as a world reserve currency. Otherwise, if we fail on energy, if we fail on some of these other things, we're looking at less than 10 years of dollar dominance globally. And I think the rest of us would want to see that to be a century or more.
Mm-hmm. So if you're opposed to a central bank digital currency, which I think everybody should be, mm-hmm. then you should see the value of Bitcoin, and there are no Bitcoin transactions without Bitcoin mining.
Right.
That's what Bitcoin mining does. Yeah. It is securing that ledger mm-hmm. for the world. So if you're anti-CBDC, you should be pro-Bitcoin, and you should be pro-Bitcoin mining.
And I think that I'm so glad we kind of ending on that point. That nuance I think is really important. And I think some people may like to smile or take shots at Elizabeth Warren for past things that she's said or done. But I think driving that point home about her motivations in this, Professor Warren being the brainchild behind the CFPB. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I believe it is, and now kind of, moving her way into this digital space. I think that's something that is important for people to keep an eye on and understanding the motivation behind this. Well, guys, this was a great conversation. I'm so glad we got to have it. And Lee, you were really one of the first people I got to know in the policy space in Texas when I moved here. So getting to know you over the last couple of years is great. And Brian, getting to know you over the last few months and meeting you in person, it's great to have you both. Before we wrap up, where can people go to learn more about you or your work?
Well, riotplatforms.com is our company website. You can find me on Twitter at MorgensternNJ. That's where I'll tweet out any op-eds we do or comments on news of the day. You can always DM me there. So, yeah, find me there.
Cool. We're TexasBlockchainCouncil.org, and on Twitter, I'm Lee_Bratcher.
Very good. Well, thank you both. This was a great conversation. Great to have you in today. And we'll wrap up, and that'll be all for this week's episode. I want to thank you for joining us. And in future episodes, we'll dive into more of the policy ideas lawmakers should consider going into the 2025 legislative session. We'll see you again soon for another exciting episode of the Rebel Tech Podcast.